The lights are bright. Good evening, everyone. My name is Archon Fung, and I'm the academic dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to tonight's forum on presidential secrecy and ethics. I know that this is a little bit of an esoteric topic, but I think we may be able to find some ways to connect it to important controversies of the day. Before I introduce tonight's guests, I want to thank the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation and the Institute of Politics for making tonight's conversations and many other great discussions possible. I encourage you to check out the IOP's website to find out more about upcoming forum events, of which there are many, many, many. We have two wonderful guests to illuminate the subjects of secrecy and ethics for us tonight. First, please welcome Ambassador Norm Eisen back to Harvard after graduating from the law school in 1991. At HLS, Norm was a classmate to current Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch. We call Norm Ambassador because he served as President Obama's ambassador to the Czech Republic. But he's not here tonight in his capacity as an expert on Czechoslovakia, which he certainly is, but rather because of his deep knowledge of ethics in government. Before becoming ambassador, Norm served as President Obama's ethics czar. He led the administration's initiatives on government ethics, lobbying regulation, and open government. A thankless job, to be sure. He was dubbed Mr. No by the media for his tough stances. Ambassador Eisen is currently a visiting fellow in governance at the Brookings Institution, where he has added topics like open government, transparency, and electoral integrity to his continued work on government ethics. You may have read his recent pieces with Richard Painter and others, or seen him talking on TV recently about the conflicts of interest that plague the current administration. Please also welcome to Norm's left, your right, Mary Graham. Mary is a longtime colleague with whom I serve as the co-director of the Transparency Policy Project, housed at the Ash Center. Like Norm, Mary also attended Harvard, but as an undergraduate, and she holds a law degree from Georgetown. Mary's a prolific writer. Her books include Full Disclosure, The Perils and Promise of Transparency, Democracy by Disclosure, and The Morning After Earth Day. She also helps to guide many important organizations in the civic sector. She served on the board of the MacArthur Foundation and currently serves on the board of directors of the Pew Charitable Trusts and the board of visitors of the Columbia School of Journalism. During her enduring concerns as a scholar, journalist, and public citizen revolve around transparency, health and safety, and new trends in environmental policy. Particularly relevant to our discussion tonight, Mary has just published a book titled President's Secrets, The Use and Abuse of Hidden Power. Mary, you might have to write a new chapter on the Trump administration in just a year or two for the second edition of your book. Okay, so why don't we start with a few questions before we open it up. Mary, your new book may be more timely than you'd planned for the last few years in which you were writing it. You offer a wonderful review of the history of how presidents have struggled with secrecy, and how candid to be with the American public, with Congress, and even within their own cabinet and other parts of the executive branch. The span of your book begins with the Constitutional Convention, and George Washington is actually quite a hero in your book, and then goes all the way through Barack Obama. Now, secrecy is it's not a direct policy issue, but rather about the democratic process. So maybe we could begin by asking you to help us understand why we should care about secrecy. Can you tell us about one or two really bad policies or decisions that have resulted from too much presidential secrecy, and a little bit about what we should worry about now? Mary.
All right. Thank you, Archon, and thank you, Ambassador Eisen. Your voice has been tremendously important to us, especially in the last few weeks. Thanks to all of you for coming. I want to reassure you that I did not have anything to do with encouraging this sequence of national events in order to sell books. Totally uninvolved. To start to answer Archon's question, I do think that we have to start with the latest dangerous use of secrecy, because President Trump's use of secrecy in the immigration order was one of the most dangerous kinds of secrecy that we see in government, and we see it reasonably often. And that is, he kept his plans hidden not only from his advisors, but also from the lawyers and also as well from the agents who would have to carry it out. That is a particularly self-destructive kind of secrecy. But in this instance, it also was very destructive to thousands of innocent people. And I think the president at least owes those people an apology. We also ourselves need to keep worrying about a leader who does not disclose his taxes, who's reluctant to talk about his health, although he's the oldest president that we'd ever elected, who is impatient with opposing views. And this kind of president, temperament is important. This kind of president will continue to find secrecy irresistible. Secrecy turns out to be the president's greatest power. It's essential to democracy, it's essential for military operations and for diplomatic negotiations, but if it's not controlled, it's also the greatest danger to democracy because it stops constitutional checks from working. George W. Bush used it to make new rules for a new kind of war without consulting the American people. Bill Clinton used it to hide affairs, Richard Nixon to hide burglaries. Woodrow Wilson, who's a reasonably big part of this book, used it to hide an incapacitating stroke and stayed in office for a year and a half, really completely unable to work. So it's a dangerous power, and I think we have to conclude that it remains the president's best tool for avoiding democratic debate.
Very good. Now, to many in the audience, it may seem that less secrecy and more transparency are obviously a good thing. However, there's been quite a bit of work recently, voices on the other side that argue that secrecy and enables candor, and too much transparency can paralyze government. So, if you ask Americans why they are frustrated with government, and many are, 70–80% in public opinion polls, the main reason that they offer is gridlock and the inability to get things done in government. One of the main reasons that presidents and other policymakers keep secrets is that big public debates, whether in Congress or media or perhaps even in their own executive branch, can paralyze government. I don't doubt that many of President Trump's supporters favor vigorous executive action. Releasing his tax returns and his full business engagements would provide fodder for hostile journalists. And so many people are upset at Mr. Steve Bannon for saying that the media is the opposition party. But 500 American newspapers endorsed Hillary Clinton in the general election, and 20 endorsed Donald Trump. So he may have a little bit of a point there. Now, if Obama had a full public debate about the ethics of drone strikes or electronic surveillance, it may have prevented those actions from occurring because of paralysis. So Norm, you're a champion of more openness, a little bit less secrecy. How do you respond to the criticism that more open government and transparency and concern for public accountability will paralyze government and just leave us with the gridlock problem that everybody's so upset about?
Thank you, Archon, Dean Fung, Mary. Thank you not just for your new book on President's Secrets. I hold some myself now. So I'm reading it with, first thing I did was to check the index to make sure that none of the secrets I held were revealed by Mary's book. And I want to thank both of you as well for your long leadership around the policy issues of transparency and openness. In answer to your question, which I'll get to in a moment after these ambassadorial honorifics at the beginning, I will say that the two of you well understand the complexities and the fact that this is a balancing, it's a dynamic balancing between openness and confidentiality that we have to do on all these policy issues. And I have to say how pleased I am that all of you here tonight are joining us. And I try to come back to Cambridge frequently. I even bring my teenager with me occasionally. I marvel at how much things have changed, but I must say the decor, architecture, and design of the Kennedy School has not changed a bit since I arrived
it'll look a lot
here.
different next year.
Since I arrived here, I saw the mess outside. Since I arrived here in 1988, with most famously with future President Barack Obama, and also with most recently noted Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch, and many other dignitaries I was shamelessly name-dropping in the green room. I guess even mentioning that I was in a green room is shamelessly name-dropping. I have found myself in the midst of the struggle over the question, and it is one of the great through lines in the history of democracy, because secrets convey power, and the history of democracy is one of the struggle for the diffusion of power from the hands of a few out to the many, and what that might even mean. And I find myself in the midst of a debate to answer Archon's question about the dangers of transparency and the downsides of openness. One of the principal proponents I am a principal proponent of the view, together with my colleagues on the stage, of the view that we need more transparency, accountability, participation, and openness as a whole. That's my thesis. And I lived it when I went to the White House and when I went to the embassy as well. We'll talk about that a little bit. There is a strong view, I think of them as the Neo-Tammany Hall crowd, exemplified, among others, by my beloved Brookings colleague, John Rausch, who thinks we've gone too far. And I've written a paper debating John on this question of whether we have too much or too little transparency. To answer your question, I'm going to answer your question with the data and with a very short anecdote, then I'm going to stop. The data do not actually suggest that we have too much transparency. Transparency is the cause of gridlock and popular angst about our government. I, for example, worked the Dodd-Frank file. I was the White House lawyer for what became Dodd-Frank. We conducted Dodd-Frank in an extraordinary the lawmaking in an extraordinary atmosphere of openness, from releasing our administration blueprint, which was a green print actually, a detailed explanation which we released to the public at the really before Congress had started doing its drafting, and then Congress taking over and we and them holding hearings and markups and debates and discussion, unusually open process, which led to we got President Obama, I sat with him after the bill was passed, and in his estimation, we got somewhere in the high 80%, low 90% of what we asked for. Transparency didn't hurt, it helped because it avoided the calamity, for example, of the Muslim ban. We were able to address things, to fix things, and get public buy-in. We used the public support to jam this good law home, and it's going to be very hard to undo as long as there's a filibuster, a legislative filibuster in the Senate. Take by comparison, I won't focus on the fiasco of the Muslim ban, although it is one. And I think, I tweeted immediately when I got the draft, when the draft leaked, unconstitutional. You can look, it was one of the fastest, will fall in court, and you see how judges are reacting. Look at the budget deal that was conducted between Obama and Boehner, the grand bargain that was conducted in total secret. When the little bit of it finally leaked out, when they brought it to the end, the little bit finally leaked out, there was such a furor on both sides, partisans, that it fell apart. I'm not in the Bob Woodward school, mostly blaming Democrats. I think it's a pox on everybody's houses. It would not have stood a worse chance of succeeding if some more of that negotiation had been in public. So I believe transparency helps us get things done up to a point.
Interesting. So those are two great examples. Now I want to turn to the current moment and then look forward a little bit. It must have been a little bit of a stunning statement for you to hear when the president was talking about, or now president, was talking about conflicts of interest, and he expressed the view that presidents can't have a conflict of interest. I think that captures a worry that some of us would have, that the early days of the Trump administration seem not to bode very well for transparency, reduction of secrecy, and good ethics. Reading Mary's book actually gave me some, at least helped me put the current moment in perspective. You talk about a lot of presidents, but only 3 of them come off very well, and actually only one as champions and proponents of openness and reduction of secrecy. And the one that comes off best is George Washington, right? And then you have 2 other presidents, Gerald Ford and Barack Obama, who do okay, but they do okay because they're responding to periods of pretty outrageous secrecy. Ford to Nixon, and then Obama to the Bush administration's excesses in the war on terror. Now, Norm, you've been the most public critic, one of the most public critics of his secrecy regarding potential conflicts of interest. Now, so the question for both of you, which you can answer in turn, is if the Trump administration attempts to operate with a high degree of secrecy, maybe even more than we've seen so far, as many past administrations have done, right? I mean, so far, the level of secrecy is, I mean, it's only been about 14 days, but the level of secrecy doesn't really hold a candle to some of what we've seen in the past with regard to Nixon or some of the other things, right? What do you view as the greatest dangers for policymaking or for governance or democracy? If we see 4 years of very high secrecy, what would you worry about?
Should I start? I think this is a particularly dangerous moment for government secrecy, not only because we have an unusual president, but because of new threats and new technology. The kind of rough accommodations that we had between openness and secrecy in the 20th century no longer work. We don't yet have agreed on limits for secrecy in the digital age. And I think the most dangerous thing, and this really is part of our democratic governance, I don't think that it's going to change because of technology or anything else. There's nothing that can stop a president who wants to do harm behind closed doors. We do have accountability, but accountability is after the fact. And after the fact usually means the damage is already done. So I worry about 2 things right now. One is we really don't have a way to stop in advance a president who does something unwise or foolish or illegal behind closed doors. The other thing that I worry about is the president's health. We still do not have any requirement that any president or candidate reveal anything to the American people about their health. We have annual financial disclosure, but Congress has never accompanied that with an independent physical exam. Presidents go out to Walter Reed all the time, but there's no requirement that the president tell you anything about his or her health. And we have had a number of situations where the president does not have the physical or mental capacity to govern. So I'm putting that second on my list of worries.
That's a big one. Norm, what are you worried about?
I don't disagree with Mary's anxieties. I worry a lot about corruption. I think that darkness is an enabling factor for corruption, and the lack of, and it's not just a question, the nature of corruption. I study systemic corruption, it's not just a question of stealing, even large-scale stealing, but corruption has a corrosive effect on government decision-making, and those decisions can cost people their lives. So I believe I wrote during the campaign with and I try to do whatever I do, bipartisan. It's a good test for me of whether I'm making sense or not. And I don't only write with Professor Painter, the Bush ethics advisor, who's a distinguished law professor, but I've even written, I write and speak with others, sometimes very conservative, Peter Schweizer, the author of Clinton Cash, a principal antagonist of the Clintons.
Yes.
And I wrote a Drain the Swamp plan, which we published in the Washington Post. And it's always interesting to see what you can agree on. In the corruption space, the thing that there is a lot of bipartisan agreement on is we need to know more about the president's and his circle's relationships with Russia. And it is extraordinary. It kind of pops up, it occupies the media, and then it submerges because of the nature of our coverage. It's extraordinary. We've been calling on a bipartisan basis to release, we even narrowed, we said just release Russia-related tax returns, and that impinges the possible corruption relating to Russian financial and other engagement secret because we don't have his taxes, which have a lot of foreign business information in them. We're unable, for example, Archon, to adjudicate the distinct claims of the president who says he does no business with Russia, and his son who says we see a lot of money pouring in from Russia, and they're a very important part of our business. Well, which is it? You can't, it's like the press, I've learned, it's like an alarm clock. And they want to do their best, and they are trying to do their best, but they can't have that same droning alarm day after day, and I'm very worried about corruption.
Very good. So this is in some ways the flip side of the question, and I don't know whether you've already articulated what your answer would be. But the question is, if you could ask President Trump and his administration to commit to openness, transparency, ethics, in short, not to be secretive, in just one area of his administration, you can only pick one, which one would it be? Only one. You get only one wish.
Archon's a tough questioner. Well, I'm going to get to that question, but let me just start by saying the president said in his inaugural address, as you know, that he was returning government to the American people. If he's serious about that, the first thing for him to do is to give the public full and accurate information. Tweets are not transparency. Tweets are an insult to the intelligence of the American people. This president has an opportunity. He says that he's a man of the people, and we so far have not seen him make good on it. I think the most important area, if we're limited to one area, for the president to be completely open about in proposals, giving the public a chance to engage, is whenever rights or American values are at stake. That's true in the immigration order. It's true in many, many things that presidents have done in the past in the open. I think that's the critical question. Americans do not like surprises where their rights and their values are concerned.
One of the things that I learned in my amazing adventure in governance that started when my classmate invited me to join his campaign, really before it was a campaign, in I guess the end of 2006, and now has been 10 years. I came to appreciate the value of information markets as opposed to information rules. So I would say that if I had to pick one thing, rather than mandating a particular rule of transparency, I would say the FOIA system, which is kind of the Freedom of Information Act, where people make their requests. I would like to see the president embrace the FOIA Reform Act that was passed in the last Congress, fund FOIA properly, and do affirmative disclosures, which is the cutting edge of FOIA. Don't wait for FOIA. We embraced, and one affirmative disclosure in particular that I'd like to see him continue, and I think he is going to continue, he hasn't taken it down off the White House website, is the White House visitor records, where previous administrations litigated on FOIA grounds and other legal bases to hide a handful of visitor records. Both administrations of both political flavors, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, both tried to keep these visitor records, healthcare task force, Halliburton-related meetings, respectively, out. I hope he'll continue putting those out. By the time Obama finished, we had over 5 million, over 6 million of them on the internet. It's an information market because anybody can go, it's become a standard part of reporting. Anybody can go on there and see how many times somebody has been in and out of the White House and why. So FOIA, including affirmative disclosures, would be my top of the list.
Good. So Mary, your comments about Twitter persuaded me not to join the Twitter war that the president is currently having with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which I was going to do after this reform of that, but I'll restrain myself. Finally, kind of looking forward and turning to the issues of persuasion and practical politics. How can we make it better? How can we strike the right balance between secrecy and public accountability, between the disclosure required by ethics and the need for executive privilege to act effectively while still preventing abuses of power in the future? So Norm, in a series of recent and really interesting, important work that you've done with Professor Painter, with Larry Tribe, and with others, you've called on the president to be more forthcoming about his business interests, in Russia, to be sure, but all over the place.
Globally.
To adhere to more demanding conflicts of interest. You disagree with his assertion that the president cannot have conflicts of interest. But what would it take to make it happen? More op-eds? Who else would have to jump in the game to make that happen?
Well, we're experiencing, I just was on NBC talking about this, literally came straight here. We're experiencing a great recalibration. I think we're going to, it happens periodically in our political system, of redistribution of power from and among the three co-equal branches of the federal government, and, by the way, the states, which are often, when we think about our checks and balances, we sometimes neglect the role that the states play. After all, the Washington case was brought by a state attorney general. And so I think what it's going to take is the judicial branch asserting its power, and that's why we warmed up with op-eds, but the next step forward was a lawsuit that we filed in federal court for the Southern District of New York, arguing that Donald Trump's acceptance of foreign government payments, contrary to the original, this is why his statement that he has no conflicts is so nonsensical. Our founders and framers were so concerned about presidential conflicts that they wrote a conflicts clause into the Constitution. You cannot take foreign government cash or other benefits of any kind whatever. That's the Foreign Emoluments Clause. And I think this is only the first. The emoluments issue has come up, by the way, in the Muslim ban litigation because there's a strange correlation.
Oh.
He's not, Painter and I wrote in the New York Times last weekend when the ban hit, that he's only banning countries where he does little or no business. Too poor to do business with Trump, and it's very peculiar if you look at the map of the region and you see the neighboring countries which have accounted for more terror on U.S. soil than the countries that he's banning. It's completely arbitrary categorization. So the courts are going to reassert their power. He's winning no friends with his history of slanging the federal judiciary. And I think you're going to see, I know this is not the last case that I'm bringing, and others are going to move as well in the courts, and you're going to see a very robust assertion, and that will force the president to be a little more transparent.
Excellent litigation strategies. So Mary, you show in your book that the pendulum swings away from secrecy and toward openness when, quote, many uncoordinated individuals and groups such as, quote, government watchdogs, troubled officials, members of Congress,
You read the book.
investigative reporters, lawyers in private practice, and liberal and conservative civil rights advocates challenge the president's authority. Now, given that we live in a relatively rare moment of unified government, Republicans control the presidency in both houses of Congress, do you see such challenges having much possibility for success in the coming years? What does the future hold, the short future, the 2, 3, 4 year future for presidential secrecy?
So I don't know if Norm would agree, but here's where I end the book on an optimistic note. I don't think that limits on secrecy have ever depended solely, or sometimes not even primarily, on Congress and the courts. Limiting secrecy has always depended on the vigilance and courage of individuals, and that's no less true now than it was in the past, whether they're, as Archon said, troubled officials within an administration, inspectors general in the agencies who now are obliged to report to Congress. There are more people watching now than there ever were before. The president can't even sneak out of the White House and get a hamburger. Woodrow Wilson had a year and a half where he was basically not operating as president. People all over the world are watching the president's every move, and I don't think secret policies work anymore. Secret operations, yes, always, in national security situations and in some other situations, but not secret policies. During this Cold War, there was a double standard. There were some things Americans could debate. There were a lot of things Americans were not supposed to know about, including assassination plots, wiretapping of civil rights leaders, all kinds of policies that the presidents and their cabinets agreed that Americans would never know about. But you can't keep secrets in democracy for very long. The bigger the secret now, the more likely it is to come out, sometimes responsibly, sometimes not responsibly. The more controversial the secret, the more likely it is to come out. So I think that the presidents are going to be acting in their own political interest if they acknowledge that they can no longer make policies behind closed doors. They have to make them, even if they're sensitive, national security policies, the use of drones, the use of cyber attacks. They have to be discussed with the American people on a level that doesn't threaten security. And then the operations, of course, can still remain secret as needed.